the issue we have in recording.
You're like, here we go again.
No,
Shadi.
no. The only issue we have is that I cannot modulate the levels of what I get and you get in your headphones. I can only give you the mix in the headphones is the thing.
Okay, gotcha.
And I need to, unless I'm not fully understanding the gear, which is totally possible, I need to make sure that the levels are good going in. And then what comes out to the headphones, I can only like do the master mix. I can't do that.
Okay.
So it's really important that like our levels are good going in.
Yeah.
But I so this little box that I bought here, this will probably all get cut from our thing, but maybe not. Maybe not. Hopefully.
We're going to bore them to death.
But this box I bought here, and I got it like a couple of months ago, they just released an update for it, which is a paid update because this is serious shit.
Okay.
But you can probably hear it in the headphones right now. It's got like live noise cancellation. So usually I can always hear that damn fan noise coming through your mic.
Oh, but now with that, it's not going to be there.
Yeah.
That's great.
And that means, because usually I need to go in and take that and then like sample that noise and remove it from your mic. And that takes some time and all that BS. But now I can just take it straight out of the...
Okay, great.
Well,
that's excellent,
that
Damir.
was super interesting.
I'm really happy to hear that.
Wow. Anyway, whatever makes life easier. So anyway, yeah, tomorrow is a holiday.
Yeah, and
tomorrow's the 3rd. I mean, for our dear listeners, so they don't get confused, because they may be listening to this on the 3rd, even though...
So this will come out tomorrow?
It might come out tonight.
Oh, wow, that's to be amazing.
We'll see. But so tomorrow is the 3rd, and tomorrow is a holiday, but you're confused by this.
Yeah, because I thought that the day for July 4th was July 4th, so it's weird that they celebrated the day before, because it's about Independence Day.
Right. But surely this has happened to you before.
Has it?
Is this the first time in your life, in your 38 years, that the 4th of July has fallen on a weekend?
So if July 4th was on a Wednesday, we would have Wednesday off, right?
Correct.
Now that we have July 4th on a Saturday, we have the day before off?
Yeah. Do you think this is decadent? Like,
it's decadence. I think this is...
The Greatest Generation, when they stormed the beaches of Normandy, they didn't get Fridays off.
It's a coddling of the American mind. We want things easy and we want to cut corners. So instead of celebrating something on the actual day, we're like, oh, Americans need an extra day off, so let's do it the day before. I think that, and it's interesting because right before I came here, I was reading this essay in Foreign Affairs, How Do Great Nations Fall? And it's really about this. It's about not realizing when a great nation is sort of on the verge of destruction. I think also, and he's talking about the Soviet Union in this context, that it's really hard to know when it's about to happen.
Right.
And so the piece was just basically talking about how do we sort of think ahead of ourselves, where we train our minds to look for signs where signs may not be obvious. And this also, I think, relates to Ross Douthat's work on the decadent society and all that. Also, so I was home in Pennsylvania with my parents and brother again.
The family. Yeah.
What can I say? Family.
Yeah.
Family bonding. And one thing we talked about, it bothered my brother a little bit. I was talking about how dogs really annoy me, and white people, or as they're known now, white people. Yeah. White people.
Yeah.
I find that so funny. For people who don't know, apparently people are spelling white people as white people, which is WYPIPO. I don't know the full...
I don't either. I've noticed it. I don't fully... I haven't bothered to investigate, quite frankly.
It's probably some conspiracy.
Yeah.
But how like white people and their dogs... And I was just making the point to my brother, hey, like this is a sign of decadence where you have stores and shops that are made for dogs.
Yeah.
And you treat dogs like human beings, and they wear clothes and costumes.
Right.
And there's even something we saw in Philly. It's like a swim club for dogs. This I have not seen before. It's not even bathing. It was actually portrayed as a club.
Yeah.
Like almost like dogs are socializing and they're swimming in the pool together. And I'm like, this is really the whatever that word is,
Yeah.
of dogs.
Yeah.
I guess they are beings, but to make them into like human beings. And I just felt like I was
It's sad.
It's sad.
But you don't like dogs. I mean, that's the other thing. I remember this. I learned this about you, I think, early on in the friendship. You're actually, or is you don't like white people with dogs? Which is it?
Well, here's the thing. It's not part of our culture.
Yeah.
So
I remember this. This was an early thing I discovered, and I was like, "Oh, edgy." Now it's not edgy anymore. Disliking white people with dogs and stuff. But your brother wasn't cool with that.
yeah, he's like, Shadi, let's not go overboard with this.
With this white people hatred.
But you know, obviously there are some issues Islamically with dogs, and you know that's not really the main reason. I just find it. I just find it like a little bit odd that you're actually having, you have like a live animal in your house and you treat it like it's part of your family. It suggests to me a certain kind of projection that people are missing some kind of deep companionship, and they make dogs into whatever that should be.
A child, right?
A child. It's basically a child.
Yeah.
And I was joking with my brother, like Sharif, like, I got to think about what my deal breakers are in relationships and marriage and, you know, thinking about this next stage in my life. And I'm like, I actually think one of my deal breakers is someone who loves dogs. That would actually be an issue, not because it would be, I could probably find a way to live with that if I fell in love with the person. But I think that it actually suggests a deeper divergence in values. Like if someone put such a value on having basically a little human being in the house that isn't actually a child, that probably means that we're not on the same page intellectually or ideologically.
Okay, but like people can have normal human to dog relationships that don't involve taking him to clubs, right?
Yes.
Is it still a deal breaker? Have you ever met a woman that has a normal?
It is funny that I think there's also like a self-selection here. I self-selection bias in the sense that the people that I've dated generally have not been dog lovers. So I think I just gravitate towards people who are not dog lovers naturally.
Yeah.
So I think there's something there that's worth unpacking. But my brother was like, Shadi, here you go again with he thought I was trolling him.
Yeah.
But then I got all serious and I made a very strong intellectual case against dogs.
Against dogs, yeah.
And my parents were like, yes. My parents, I think, sided with me because they come obviously from a culture where dogs were on the street.
Yeah.
So for them, it's still like a little bit unusual.
Right. Yeah.
Not that people can't become Americanized over time, but I think there are limits to that process of Americanization. And one of them is something, you know, I have found that it's still, Arabs can be in the US for decades, but generally speaking, if they are immigrants, it's hard for them to really get on board with the idea of having a dog inside of the house. I've had quite seriously, I've seen it. It's quite rare in my experience. Anyway, this is all like a weird divergent from what we really should be talking about. And it's funny because we're trying to promote this podcast as entirely unscripted and raw.
Yeah.
And we take that seriously. But of course, generally speaking, before I actually meet up with you, Damir, we at least put out a topic.
Yes.
We don't.
Well, sometimes we have gone into this somewhat cold, right?
Yeah. But usually we at least like have some vague notion of the topic area. This time we don't really even have that. I mean, we did say, let's talk about progress.
Yes. Well, you wanted to talk to me about progress and my lack of faith in it.
Yeah, but that's a pretty broad topic.
It is. And yeah, it very.
So,
but I mean, so here's the interesting one. Maybe here's a way to start thinking about it. You mentioned that Charles King essay in Foreign Affairs. And I guess maybe the question a better one would be is not like, do I believe in progress? I remember it was several months ago, me and my colleague Aaron, we interviewed Branko Milanovic, the Serbian economist, and about his new book. And at one point, there's some aside in the book where he talks about, I forget exactly, but we broached on it about like sort of views of history, whether one sees it as, again, sort of linear or cyclical, right? I like the Charles King essay because it talks about decline. And I don't know, maybe that's just sort of a personality trait of mine that I see decline in a lot of places, and maybe that's what makes me not a progressive. But it's interesting, like you can't really think about decline unless you also imagine the opposite. It can't be just perpetual decline. Like that's nonsense. So I mean, the question is like, are you a declinist? Am I a declinist? Is anyone a declinist who has a linear view of history? I think not. I mean, unless you have some sort of idea that, well, let me modify that. One might say that the sort of Catholic integralists think that there was an ideal society and it's all been downhill since then. The sort of like falling back from some kind of,
and also Islamists and Salafis in this regard, that the ideal moment in history is the time of Prophet Muhammad, and nothing can really aspire to those heights again. So everything in some sense is decline compared to that period. And that's why there's this idea, obviously, of the return to purity and all of that.
Oh, yeah, no, that's absolutely correct. I hadn't, yeah, no, of course, I hadn't for some reason that had slipped
You don't,
mind.
because you don't care about Muslims, Damir.
No.
You don't think about us.
I don't spend a lot of time thinking about these things. No, but obviously that's true. But that's interesting, right? Like that's a kind of conservatism that actually I have no time for. It's like in a smaller version of conservatism is like a dumber version is like, oh, the 1950s were great. And then it's like, it's all been downhill like that. That's a certain kind of like not very reflective kind of conservative set of ideas, right?
Well, your position is sort of that nothing was really great. There is no ideal
right. Well, that gets
society
to
to strive for.
Well, maybe that's right. I mean, but it's also inherent in that as a kind of cyclical view of history also, right?
Yeah.
Is that I mean, it does feel sometimes that there's sort of a finite amount of misery in the world, and you can shuffle that around in different ways and improve life perhaps, but you're not going to transcend that misery. I mean, I think that's sort of a bedrock belief of mine, especially when I think about foreign policy and things like that.
Did you come up with that on your own? Because I actually haven't heard that before.
Which
Is that
one?
a new idea?
No, not really. I mean, especially on foreign policy, that's how I look at things.
I know that but I mean, like, is it Damir's creation or are you drawing? Because I mean, that sounds very fresh to me. It's similar actually to something that our friend Samuel Goldman, professor at GW in political theory, was saying on Twitter the other day, that there's a finite amount of religiosity in the world that is constant. It's the only thing that changes is how it's distributed and how people express this innate religious longing. So some people can express it in secular ways. They can suppress it. They can do drugs, sex, other ways to express what's missing. But it's always there. And it's just a question of how societies try to order what is a constant source of religious feeling. You're saying something similar, that there's always misery is constant. It's just redistributed in interesting ways over time. Yeah,
I mean, I'm surprised that you're saying that's somehow original. I've never thought of it as original.
Damir, I'm just trying to hype you up here.
I appreciate it. But again, nothing's original. That's the other sort of anyway, but yeah, right. That sounds right to me. And so, it's
okay, let me push you, Damir, here, because I mean, I want to turn the tables on you a little bit, because usually you're the one who's pushing me.
Go on.
But so we were on our group chat with some of the best and brightest. Actually, I think that the group chat should be renamed to the best and brightest.
Let's do.
Now it's just called Politburo.
Yeah.
Nice Soviet reference there. But of course, best and brightest is meant ironically because
we're not that bright.
And also, the best and the brightest oftentimes, fuck things up.
Sure.
But putting that aside, but we were talking about the idea of progress and how I think me and a couple other people in the chat were saying that as uncomfortable as we are with some of the woke excesses, there is some optimism to be had in the sense that things might actually get better once we start addressing mass incarceration, police abuse, that there is something to be positive about, and there are actually ways to significantly improve the lives of Black citizens. And you were skeptical, and it gets back to something we were talking about last time, the politics of symbolism, that you still see a lot of this as symbolic performance. But even so, even if that's partly true, there still is this sense that people are getting better on core issues. Like the popular sentiment and public opinion polling on mass incarceration has moved, in my view, in a better direction, where more Americans realize that this is a fundamental problem and more policymakers are open to doing something about it. Where I think your response was that we've tried so many things over the past 5-6 decades, including with the Great Society, with various programs, affirmative action. You didn't say that specifically, but that's one of them. And there's also programs like Head Start addressing, addressing issues around integration, busing, things like that, that were attempted in the 70s and so on. Different programs of urban renewal. Even public housing originally was meant to be a constructive thing, and then we saw the dark side of public housing. So I think your position, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that the stickiness of there's a sort of tragic stickiness of bad situations, especially when there's a cycle of poverty and inequality, that makes it actually very difficult to improve the lives of Black Americans. And I think one example, also in something I read before I came here, Walter Russell Mead had an article where he mentions that the racial inequality gap has remained constant, and maybe in some ways has even gotten worse from the 1960s onwards. So despite all of our good intentions, we can't actually apparently make improvements on these key issues. And I think that's where your sense of the tragic comes from.
Yeah, look, how to be precise about this. Again, and this gets back to the question, is like, I'm not saying progress is not possible. You can't make lives better. There's a lot of things that one can unpack here. I do think that, okay, so many ways to unpack it. American policing's weird. It's an outlier in a lot of ways. You look at how policing's done in other countries. Yeah, look, it's violent in a lot of ways, especially for out communities, and African Americans are the out community in America and have remained for all sorts of reasons. But still, you look at the statistics, and it's off the charts how different, how much more we jail people, how nasty our pathologies are. My feeling is that, for all the reasons that you cited, including Walter's really good article, which you didn't mention, is actually about a book on reparations.
Yes.
That
I think it's called From Here to Equality, which is a good title.
That's right. It's striking how what I see happening right now is, again, a lot of this sort of symbolic warfare. And the sort of core conviction I see in people is, well, if we just change enough minds about this sort of stuff, we'll get at we can get at serious sort of proper solutions to this. Why I am skeptical, by and large, is not just that, like, we've tried a lot of sort of policy, because there's many other policies that we try, and it's quite possible that we can pull ourselves out of this sort of really different from other countries' policing trends that we have, and I just feel like a lot of these things are embedded and linked to other things. This is why I come back to the question why I am and was more optimistic about sort of the Bernie and Liz approach to these questions, because they're bigger and more holistic and talk about it, and why I'm so still down on what's happening with this woke stuff. There's a really good article, I could look it up right now, but maybe you can conjure it up, by this woman in Tablet that talked about the sort of self-help nature of a lot of this stuff. After I'm done talking, I can look it up or put it in the show notes in any case, but just talks about how so much of this movement, or at least sort of the outward manifestations of it, are like, if only I change how I perceive these things, that work on improving myself will then radiate out into society and change society. Maybe it's too glib of me to be scornful of that as being too simplistic. And maybe, as you say, as also some other people on the group were saying, it's like, well, like awareness is being raised, that ain't nothing. That's going to motivate different kind of politics, and you got to start somewhere. I'm open to that. I'm deeply skeptical of it for all the reasons that that I just have this feeling that the reasons that we have the kind of society we have doesn't just boil down to ill feelings and bigotry towards African Americans. And furthermore, I think the legacy of slavery is more complicated than just the bigotries of individuals.
So on that, it's interesting that when you were talking about this idea of you change awareness on the individual level, this idea of personal spiritual improvement, which is the Robin DiAngelo model in her book, White Fragility, this idea that if we all do our part as individuals, and I shouldn't say we because it's directed to white people.
Yeah, right.
And yeah. But if we all do our part, then this will kind of filter up the individual changes, then the community changes, then society changes. And perhaps the theory of change there is that eventually, if you have enough individuals who have changed their level of spiritual awareness, then there can be a sort of spiritual change on the mass level, and therefore on the policy level, which reminds me of the Muslim Brotherhood's model of change, this idea that if individual Egyptians or Arabs or Muslims more generally would just return to the faith on their own, then they can build better families, and then better families can build better communities. It's a certain way of looking at how long-term change happens. Of course, in their case, it didn't work. It didn't actually work out. It turns out it's very difficult to change societies that way. Because state power has its own logic and is in some ways its own monster. So you can have a nation of good-natured, well-intentioned individuals, but not have actual structural policy change. And I think that's the core weakness of the Robin DiAngelo model. So I'm with you on that. But and this is where I wonder. Let's say that Liz. I guess we're on a first name basis where they're Liz and Bernie. If one of them had won, one of them had become president. I wonder, so that would have actually potentially at least led to deep structural change. I like this idea of, a massive redistribution program where you give specifically poor and just lower class, maybe lower middle class people, not reparations, because it wouldn't be reparations. It would just be a certain kind of payment. Because I don't like the idea of where if you have a reparation system and you give whatever it is, $50,000 or $250,000, different figures on this for a family. And if it's a black family that's upper class, it just seems odd to me to think that they would need $250,000 when that could be, so that's also where this sort of, I'm not exactly a socialist, but to me it seems obvious that you wouldn't want to give the same amount of money to rich black people as you would give to poor black people, but maybe that's just me. But let's say you did have this deep structural approach to inequality. Do you believe that if Bernie had his ideal program and instituted it, would that lead to quote unquote progress?
It would lead to change. Look,
but why wouldn't that be progress?
Well, so look, the other question that comes of this is, I'm not sure I have a definitive opinion on it, but it's an interesting one, which is when we talk about models and cycles of these sorts of things. And maybe then this is an argument for, the woke revolution. even if I'm skeptical about it. But maybe the way progress is done is that it only happens with proper revolutions and refoundings. That actually incremental change always is a process of decay and patching, but never actually a big enough change. And arguably that's part of the argument that the real revolutionaries believe. Now, again, how many real revolutionaries do we have among this? I don't know. Maybe that's an interesting question. It's an interesting thing to think about. I actually, just before you came, I went back and then I realized it's too long and sort of too hard to skim without a little bit more prep. But it's I've seen several people reference Book 8 of Plato's Republic, talks about sort of the decline, from timocracy to oligarchy to democracy to tyranny, right? That sort of decline, and each one of those, to a certain extent, includes a revolution, right? As one changes from one to the other, it is sort of a revolutionary, but it's revolutionary decline. So I don't know. There's many ways to sort of skin this cat, but I do wonder. It's a fair point to say, like, if Bernie had gotten everything, as opposed to the maximalist. I'm not even going to say Black Lives Matter, because like the maximalist sort of like woke manifesto, if such a thing exists. But let's say that like you get this kind of revolutionary social change that I think embedded in it is a certain kind of anti-markets, self-loathing about Western civilization as a colonialist, violent, expropriating everything. And then you found some new sort of society after all the sort of reckoning is done. Whether that's a refounded society and whether that's a proper new start that you can start building on. I don't think the revolutionaries have thought all this through, but it's not necessarily on the revolutionaries to think everything through. It's not like during the French Revolution they had figured everything out as they were going on. I mean, it had its own internal logic.
But also, I mean, there, almost by the very nature of America and the American idea, we're never going to have enough revolutionaries to have a revolution. I think that's what people sometimes lose sight of, because our system is actually pretty good at adapting and responding to revolutionary demands if enough people have them. So in this case, with the BLM movement, we already see the co-option of a lot of that, at least symbolically. And I think that when we're talking about the elite, upper class, educated Americans who are at the vanguard of the woke movement, honestly, I don't think they're actually comfortable with deep structural change in economic or class terms, because they're a product of a society that for them would be at least somewhat classless. I mean, the very fact they were able to rise to the upper middle class or upper class and that they're New York Times staffers. I mean, I have trouble. There's something silly about the idea of New York Times staffers playing the role of revolutionaries.
No, I agree. I 100% agree with that. But I mean, let's separate that out. That's where my scorn for the current moment comes from, because I do think that it's superficial. That while there might be true revolutionaries among Black Lives Matter who have a vision of truly revolutionary change, most of the sort of woke nonsense is just like a certain kind of virtue signaling, a certain kind of belief in change that is superficial and starts with transforming the individual. I'm very skeptical of that model of change. It's interesting to me, though, is like, again, going back to Plato and Book 8 in the Republic, right, is the question of, I guess that shift from oligarchy to democracy, right? And in Book 8, the concept of democracy is not Republican democracy. It's equalism of a certain sort. It's a leveling. And Plato sees this as decline, right? As a revolution that leads to a worse kind of society. I'm not sure how how one then thinks about what like a successful Bernie presidency whether that leads us to basically just tweaks to the system that are healthy and improve. And I think that's what would happen, because Bernie would get blocked on a lot of this stuff. And I think that's what would happen, as opposed to the maximalist demands of the sort of, the woke, that if their revolution and they've managed to refound the project in some profound way, I think that would be, a decline. But I don't know. I mean, that's the thing. I was getting in sort of dumb, pissy fights on Twitter. Every time someone mentions the French Revolution, it triggers me, because I don't know. Obviously it's complicated, and on Twitter it's particularly easy.
How would you sum up the legacy of the French Revolution in 2 or 3 sentences?
One sentence, right? It's too early to tell. You know that famous one.
Yeah.
It's still a good one. No, I don't know. The main thing for the French Revolution, I do kind of think that is that, what sets the Anglo world apart. The Glorious Revolution wasn't really a revolution in England, and the American Revolution wasn't really a revolution. Despite the rhetoric of a lot of it, where it's very different from what the French Revolution was, and that's very different from what then racked the continent in Europe. Which there is a line from the French Revolution to the Russian Revolution, and then to all the other sort of hard left wing things, and it's at the same time the Anglo ones are profoundly different things, different beasts. I think there's an element of cultural propensity to religion in Anglo cultures that shapes these things in a very different way than they happen in on the continent. There's something profoundly, well, I guess the French Revolution also has this sort of crazy moment when they, start, I forget what it is, the creator or the great being. I forget what Robespierre starts talking about at some point, but it's grounded in a kind of like hyper rational secularism, which none of the Anglo ones are. And it's when I'm being glib on Twitter and arguing about this, it's to preserve that. It's that the Anglo-American experiment and what it's yielded is different from just sort of run-of-the-mill revolutionary stuff that happened on the continent. And I think that now, it's hard to talk about democracy on the European continent without acknowledging that, the roots of it ultimately are in these convulsions of 1789. But there's a lot of bad that came from that. A lot of chaos, a lot of really interesting history. But I can't get myself to the point of glib enthusiasm when people start saying, well, the French Revolution liberated the people and, deposed the aristocracy, and therefore it's the good. And then when people then turn around and say, well, clearly the shortcomings of the American Revolution is that like it didn't go far enough and wasn't egalitarian enough. Now, yeah, Jefferson was a slaver. A lot of them were. Like Adams was one of the few good founding fathers in a lot of ways. However, he was an aristocrat too, or at least like had a very aristocratic sort of approach to these things. I don't know. It's a very complicated thing, but it really gets my back up when people start praising the French Revolution in the way of an early French revolutionary, and don't really grasp in which ways the Anglo version of all of these things is infinitely superior. And it has a lot to do with the whole question of what is a revolution.
Yeah, and I think there's an Anglo propensity towards prudence, even in times of like the revolutionary ferment. I mean, I guess, and maybe I would have to kind of think through this a little bit more, but it gets to something we were talking about in another group chat, which is why is there something distinctive about the American commitment to either religion, and I don't mean necessarily organized religion, but but religious belief or a belief in something transcendent, which can lead to utopian overreach. But in this particular case, it seems to be blunted because there's some kind of God conscious structure. I don't know. I mean, there seems to be something there that distinguishes it from, as you said, the hyper secular rationalism of the French Revolution, which without God and with only reason turns into something quite destructive.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm not even close to feeling able to answer what that is. I mean, I've in that group chat where you're mentioning, I mean, it's like I'm spending a lot more time recently reading about English history in particular, even before sort of getting into deeper dives on some of this American stuff. But it's oh man, I'm blanking on the name. It's one of the theoreticians of nationalism. Bear with me. I'm going to actually find this because it's important. She makes the case that, come on, Kindle, get out of my way. She makes the case that nationalism.
Okay, Damir, you know what I just forgot about?
Tell me.
We said that we were going to have a live audience and like a person sitting on that couch. We said that Jaffer would sit on that couch.
Hold on, before you do that, let me just fix that clicking thing that's also driving me insane. We'll edit this part out.
I mean, so for those of you who can't see us now, which I guess is all of you, there is a couch there, and you probably fit 3 people on it with social distancing, maybe 2. But a friend of ours, Jaffer, he's a fan of the podcast, and he was talking about like he could be part of this like 1-person live audience and not necessarily heckle us, although I suppose he could, but he could like laugh and make noises. I guess we'd have to have a mic for him.
No, I've got mics. You know, I've got mics.
Yeah. Or, he could be the kind of that person who's like the hype man.
Yeah.
He doesn't actually like
laughs at our jokes.
Like he wouldn't have to like contribute substantively, although I guess he could if he really wanted to. But it sort of reminds me of like the woman who's on the Howard Stern show. She doesn't actually engage that much in a substantive way, but she just sort of like offers color commentary in real time.
Racist. She's black, you know.
Oh my God!
Leah Greenfeld is the name of the nationalism theoretician that I was talking about.
I'm pretty sure that Howard Stern's person on the show is not named Leah Greenfield.
No, it's called Robin.
Robin. Yeah, her name's Robin. Right. That's true.
Did you listen to Howard Stern back in?
Yeah, I did actually.
I did too.
It's a bummer that he went. I mean, this is actually like an interesting. I think about this sometimes. Why someone who has so much mass influence and is able to be part of a national conversation through his show would like voluntarily decide to like defang himself in terms of influence by signing an exclusive contract with Sirius. And now only people who have that subscription can listen to him. It's just like really interesting. And someone was making this comment, or maybe I read it somewhere.
About Joe Rogan, right? That was the difference, yeah.
Yeah, that if you tell someone under 30 about Howard Stern, they're like, wait, what? I mean, we vaguely heard of him, but we've never heard any of his shows. So he's really declined in national relevance. And it's just like an interesting thing about what do we value? Having a model where we reach a smaller number of people who are dedicated to us by virtue of a subscription or something like that, or do we go for the mass audience at the expense of, say, like monetary bliss?
Yeah, well, he cashed out, right?
Howard Stern, yeah.
He cashed out, and I mean, the criticism of him now is that he cashed out too early, and he left a lot of money on the table.
Yeah,
which is what you see with Joe Rogan's deal on Spotify.
Yeah, it's interesting.
But then the question is like whether Joe Rogan screwed up too. I mean, that has been a lot of the criticisms, right? That if he had managed his own stuff and not gone to Spotify, and they gave him a bunch of cash up front, but he no longer. Well, I don't know the specifics of his deal, and I don't listen to Joe Rogan, so I don't actually know. but there's some talk that if he stayed open, and he could have kept most of that money himself. And if they're willing to pay him whatever $100 million, and their valuation went like like 2 billion or something. I don't know, some crazy.
Yeah.
Clearly, something's wrong there.
But it's like this perpetual dilemma of like, do we want to be on the indie level, or do we want to become like U2? Like in
me and you?
podcast terms, like, yeah. So, and it also relates to the questions that we're asking about our own lives in the post-COVID era and how we want to spend the time that we have left in this world. Not that we're, no.
Do you have COVID, Shadi? Are you telling me you've got COVID and you're here in my apartment?
If you're contending, we've thought, I think we've all thought about death a little bit more and what kind of legacy we want to leave in this world and what our signature will be. And my dad, I was talking to my dad about this, how does one leave a signature? And you have to at some point,
focus
on children, not to go totally off track here, but
children, dogs, and then we'll be back to Leah Greenfeld again. It's totally fine. Go on. Keep going.
I guess I'm torn at this point in my life where part of me wants to have talk to a smaller group of people who are part of a niche community, but part of me also wants to have impact because I do want to see things change. I do want ideas that I think are important to have a mass audience. I guess it's just like we all deal with this. If we're writers, if we're, this is, and I think about like my favorite bands and the whole, like, should they go for the major label? I guess it's not as relevant as it was in the 90s and 2000s, where if you got a major label deal, you're like, oh, wow, now we can reach the masses with our music, where I think that's,
so I played in bands, and like, it's interesting that you bring that up. There, so do you know, does the name Steve Albini mean anything to you?
Oh yeah. He's the engineer or producer for Nirvana who has that special style of having like
PJ Harvey too, like PJ Harvey's first record, The Breeders.
Oh The Breeders too. Yeah, but he had the mics placed in certain ways in the recording room to get this sense that the listener is almost there, like listening in, right?
I mean, the thing is, like, Steve Albini's stuff is the drums. You can always tell like a Steve Albini record because the drums are like overpowering, and it has that like feeling of like you're actually at a concert where the drums are often overpowering. I mean, depends how the concert's mixed, but it's like if you're in a room with a band, it's just like the drums are, and he is like he'd always like that's if you listen to the first Breeders record, Pod, or the first PJ Harvey record, or the Pixies first record. It's like the drums are like and especially comparing later on. Of course, with the Nirvana, it's reversed. The breakout hit was Nevermind, and that's really slickly produced. And then,
but their first album was Bleach, right?
Sure, that's not Steve Albini.
Oh, that's not. Okay.
Albini did the last one.
Oh, in utero.
In utero, that's right. And it's because they idolized him, they loved him because they came from that scene. And finally, I mean, Kurt Cobain fought the labels in a big way to allow them to do Steve Albini's thing. The fascinating thing about In Utero, again, this is not getting deep holes for our audience, but like if you go listen to it, there's like 2 or 3 songs that sound very different on In Utero, and those are the ones that the label was so horrified with what Albini had done with the record that they demanded that like 2 of them be remixed so they can have a something they can put on the radio.
Oh, right. Yeah. Because there weren't really any radio hits on that album. But also, I think that basically what Kurt Cobain was trying to do was he was giving the middle finger to, they get big with Nirvana, with, whatever Nevermind. Yes.
Nevermind. Yeah.
Nevermind. Yeah. And that's their breakthrough. They become huge, popular, all that. And he reacts against that and he feels almost repelled by his own fame. And then he says basically, fuck you to the listeners with the subsequent album. And it makes me think that
but not to the listeners. I love that subsequent album. I mean,
but it wasn't as popular and it doesn't have as many anyway. But
but right. But it gets at what we're talking about, but go on. Yeah.
Yeah. And in some ways, I was just thinking about this, that, Ta-Nehisi Coates is the Nirvana of writers, that he got really big. And you could always tell with Ta-Nehisi that he wasn't comfortable with the new status that was imparted upon him. He didn't like being feted and celebrated, especially by predominantly white audiences. So there was always this kind of contentious relationship that he had with his own burgeoning fame. And now I think we see, that he's in a sense, he decided quite consciously, as far as I can tell, to retreat, and he's not as present in the moment.
Sure.
And he's doing his own passion projects, and he got off Twitter, and he just doesn't want to deal with all that. But it's, Pearl Jam may be similar in some regards too, that after their fame with their first 2 or 3 albums in the 90s, they they had a niche audience, they stayed with that, but they never got as big again, even though everyone knows the name Pearl Jam, just as everyone will know the name Ta-Nehisi Coates.
Yeah. And it's really interesting parallels in a lot of this. Like, Pearl Jam sort of became then a touring band, and they became sort of like a cult touring band, not quite like the Grateful Dead, but I think following in a lot of those sort of footsteps of like having a cult following, and they tour, and Pearl Jam tours are a big deal. Back to Steve Albini though, he wrote, I remember this. So Steve Albini is like a godfather of a lot of, he was like in this 80s band, this like punk rock band, really abrasive. His production style is really abrasive, though notorious in a lot of ways. And he had started his own label, not his own label, his own studio in Chicago called Electrical Audio that's still there, I think. And he wrote, I think it was like Maximum Rock and Roll Zine. He wrote an essay called like Some of Your Friends Are Already This Fucked. And it was about signing to major labels and about the sort of, the attractions of it, the money up front. But he lays out, I think in really good detail about like how the game is rigged if you decide to play the game along the lines of, getting fame. And that's sort of this ongoing thing that I think goes through the 90s in a lot of ways. A lot of the bands that I was really into, some of them went major and turned to crap and then became irrelevant. Some of them like stuck to their guns, and like Fugazi being the most famous one, DC's own Fugazi, like they stuck to their guns and great success, like incredible integrity, really great albums. But they're Ian MacKaye lives in Mount Pleasant. He's not a rich man right now.
Oh, he still lives in DC?
Oh yeah.
Can we hang out with him?
We could have him on the show.
Oh my God, that would actually be amazing.
We should try and find Ian. I don't know. I'm sure we can figure out a way to get to him, and he'd be really interesting to talk about what's going on right now.
Well, I mean, you have some cred because your band actually got somewhat well known.
No. But so my band, not really at all. But the interesting thing is, like in Baltimore, like when we were, I was playing in these bands and stuff like that. It was really interesting of our sort of cohort of bands. No, it's hard to say. Like there's a good number of them. Some people went and, the really talented musicians ended up joining like super successful bands. But of like our tight cohort, one really made it, made it in the sense that like got like a real label with like tour support and got to actually, tour the country. For me,
who were they?
This is my friend Roman Keebler, and he started with a band called Roads to Space Travel, which was great. And then his band was called the Oranges Band. And, again, this is what we're talking about, like the scale of making it. But they were on Lookout Records at first, which was like a San Francisco punk rock label. And then I'm trying to remember that was one of those labels that was sort of indie, but then ended up more connected. And I remember one of their songs, like I think made it like MTV and was like in a car commercial, for Christ's sakes, and that's like making it. But it was interesting is like, it became a lot more professional for Roman and his band. And, as he tried to do it, a lot of the original members were like, can't do the touring. I mean, it's all the sort of stuff that sort of happens. And so I think Roman made some great records. It never went like super, super major, but it was interesting. For me, never like there was not even an option to go that pro. I really enjoyed just doing music for its own sake and hanging out with my friends and doing music. I thought that was super, super important. And I still, to this day, it was like one of those great joys was like I would go with my friends and we'd play music to practice, and like write songs. And then we'd play shows. And maybe we'd play a couple of shows out of town. And that was all I really wanted out of it. And it was super meaningful. And sure, yeah, like we actually had our songs played on BBC once or twice. And that was like the height of what we managed to do.
Wait,
yeah, like John Peel's show. John Peel's on on Radio 4, like played
Oh man, I
us.
forgot you were on John Peel.
No, we weren't. We didn't do a Peel session. He didn't invite us to like fly us to London or anything like that. We weren't that big, but like John Peel you'd send him records and he would play them. And so once you got played on Peel, that was for like our level of crappy little band was super super gratifying. Look, this is a long long side, but all I'm getting at is like for me, I always took that Steve Albini thing to heart about doing it for the love of what you're doing it for. And then success may follow. I mean, I bring up Roman and the Oranges band as actually a really interesting hybrid thing because they made it pretty far, and Roman like did it for the love of the thing, but he also tried to make sort of a career out of it. And it's I think it's just important that you follow it as much as it matters to you, and do it for the right reasons and not worry about like making it. Because if you're doing it for the right reasons and you're totally passionate about it, you will make it. Maybe you won't be like, U2, but fuck it, who cares? Like ultimately, I stick to those guns, I think people that try and be U2 usually fail being U2. And you can just try and be the best of what you are and what you're trying to do and do the best job at that as possible. Not worry about like trying to be fucking Bono.
No joke, man. That's actually like really good advice that applies to a lot of things. And these are issues that I think we all struggle with. So it sounded like it was a lot about music, but actually I think listeners should really take what Damir said to heart, because I need to take that to heart. I'm afraid of losing sight of why I do what I do. And sometimes I'm reminded of it. So when someone sends me, it could be just someone I've never talked to before, just a random tweet who says, "Listen, Shadi, what you do is meaningful to me, and it's connected with me, and it's changed how I see something in a particular way." And that gives me a certain level of gratification that, having 100,000 eyeballs on some like random article I wrote in 2 hours, like, it's different things that you value. But there are a lot of grifters out there who I think, they lose their integrity in our space in terms of, maybe doing things not for the ideas, but for the fame or the attention, and not to name names in this regard,
Right?
But but there's also people who are like really legitimate, like Tim Snyder, the Yale historian, who I think unfortunately in some of his more recent stuff is just like writing silly pamphlets for the masses and indulging their worst instincts. But so it is sort of it is this question of how we get the balance right. And I think that what we're doing here, and I never like to get self-serious, but I do sort of see this, I guess, Damir, what you're trying to say, like this is our version of recording something with Steve Albini. Is
Right.
that the metaphor you're going for?
Well, the metaphor is more like I enjoy doing this. Like I enjoyed playing with my band. We never even got like to the point where we could, get our act together enough to gather our money to go to Chicago to record with Steve Albini, because Steve Albini will record anyone. But no, it's even more basic than that. We have a box that we're speaking into here. We're doing it ourselves. That's what I love about it. It's like totally DIY. It's what's really fun about doing this sort of stuff. It's hanging out with friends and putting out something that seems valuable to me, and that's the biggest part of it.
I mean, what we're trying to say, Domino's Pizza, is that if you try to sponsor us with your corporate dollars,
we won't turn you down.
We will say yes, but we will still record it just like this.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. Look. So. Dogs, freedom.
Wait, do we got to do this whole like extra 50? Oh, okay. So because we started this Patreon, and the first tier, I think that people get an extra 15 minutes. It's sort of meant to be a podcast within the podcast. How do we do that, Damir? Do we have to actually announce that and do like a natural stop then continue, or?
Well, the beauty is now you're teasing it for the people who haven't.
Oh
paid.
wow, they're gonna
Be so jealous and left out.
Oh man,
because in like maybe 5 more minutes we will stop and then start recording again.
Oof, podcast FOMO.
Yeah, podcast FOMO. Anyway, look, I think it's just to wrap up that little curly Q after we're going from political decline into whatever the hell we're doing. Yeah, I do think I feel pretty good about throwing out the Patreon and seeing if if it resonates with people. I mean, again, the feedback on Twitter is always super, super gratifying when people hear something and connect. Just sort of throwing out Patreon, if people are willing to sort of support what we're doing, that's super gratifying. But it feels legit and right in the way that again, sort of doing an indie or punk rock record feels right, because you're doing it because you care about it. And then if people want to sort of buy and support it, awesome. Otherwise, you'd still do it anyway.
Yeah, because this is actually literally who we are. I mean, people might not believe it, but we're, for the most part, maybe sometimes we do, but for the most part, we're not putting on airs. We're not actually performing. This is me and Damir hanging out.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, pretty much. I feel like I want to close the loop on Leah Greenfeld, though, somehow.
Oh, wait. Remind me who she is again?
Oh, that's what we're talking about, religiosity and the Brits. That's what it was. It was the religiosity and the Brits. Yeah. So the interesting question about this is, you're saying, what is it about the Anglo-American tradition and temperance and things like that? What I liked about Leah Greenfeld's book is that she really posits Britain as a First Nation, the First Nation state, and the first concept of nationhood, and that everything else is sort of like a reaction to that, apart from the Americans, who are sort of like a splinter of that, right? But it's that the French, and then the Germans are reacting to the French, and that sort of German kind of nationalism springs up, and then ultimately the Russians are just also feeling left out, and just sort of like this rolling wave. She doesn't really talk about the Chinese and how that's playing out in Asia, but it's there is something different about the Anglo thing. I think if you take sort of like a cultural view of the world, progress, again, what you also wanted to start this conversation on, it doesn't work in the way that I think revolutionaries like to think about it. I think that's my takeaway from it. The notion of progress, I don't think I have a good model of it, but it's certainly not one of improvement in the way that most people seem to think it is. That, if we only get a grip on ourselves, we can improve the world. That the world operates in such simple moral categories, even though the good and the sort of sane society and sane societal development is tied to very moral and religious things that are, I think, tied to the Anglo question. So I'll leave it at that. That's how I'll tie up my little thing before we went on this big aside.
Wow, yeah. That was a nice little loop we did.
Yeah. I feel dizzy.
Yeah. It also reminds me that I kind of I mean, not like we'll do a lot of this on the podcast, but it does. I mean, I love music, and I mean, I love, and I don't know how much we've talked about this. Actually, Damir, you might not remember this, but we were on the way back from Sonia and Jeremy's wedding.
The Kinks, I remember very well.
Yes, we were in the car. I actually remember it so vividly. I was in the back seat, and I guess you were in the front. And I think there were 4 or 5 of us in the car. And Sonia and Jeremy, 2 of her good friends, they got married in, I think, April 2017. And this was actually when we were friends, but we weren't close yet. And, and you put on the Kinks. And I remember that I was like, oh my God, these are like I knew some of the more famous Kinks songs, but I didn't actually know some of the deeper cuts. And then I dove into that a little bit more afterwards, and ever since then I've come to a deeper appreciation of one of the great British bands.
Yep.
But it was clear at that point early on in our friendship that you had, rather good taste in music.
I wish we could actually play music on this. That's one of those things that really kills me about actually doing it. You talk about having no budget and just sort of DIYing everything. Is because you got to license that stuff to play it.
Really?
That's why I do love doing the cold open, because it's perfectly free and totally DIY.
Oh, so if we wanted theme music, we'd have to get a permission for that.
Well, I mean, there's websites where you can actually download like canned music, and that's royalty free and the rest of this. But if we wanted to play a Kinks song, I don't know. There's like a couple of seconds that you can play, I think, and it's still fair use, but it's a couple of seconds is nothing. You want to get into sort of the deeper stuff on this. Anyway, Shadi, a pleasure as always.
Yeah, good to talk to you, Damir.
Yeah.